Late evening had enveloped the city park in silence, broken only by the faint sounds of footsteps on the rain-slicked paths. A young black woman named Amina was returning home after a long day at work. Her thoughts were wandering around her daily concerns when suddenly a loud voice stopped her. Two police officers stood in the empty alley, their uniformed figures standing out against the dim light of the street lamps. "Hey, you!" one of them called out, a tall, fair-skinned man with a confident expression. His tone was insistent, and his eyes studied Amina appraisingly. "Stop for a minute." Amina frowned, her heart pounding. She knew she had done nothing wrong, but in this silence their presence was unsettling. She took a step closer, trying to remain calm, but her voice still trembled. "Something wrong, officers." The second policeman, the younger one, grinned and whispered something to the first one. Then he said loudly, "You look suspicious. Girl, what's in your bag?" His voice was full of undisguised mockery. Amina frowned, not understanding what she had done to provoke such a reaction. She knew she should answer calmly. "There are only textbooks and my things in the bag," she said, trying to speak evenly. "Oh, textbooks," the elder one drawled, his tone clearly sarcastic, "or maybe something forbidden." At that moment, the younger one pulled a pack of cigarettes out of his pocket and handed them to Amina with a defiant look. "If you're so honest, let's see how you handle it. Or are you afraid?" His grin widened. Amina didn't understand what they wanted from her, but she felt that the situation was becoming more and more absurd. She tried to refuse, but their tone became more and more insistent. There was no one around, and the atmosphere was getting thicker, forcing her to think about how to get out of this situation without consequences. Anxiety filled the night air, and it seemed as if this meeting was only the beginning of something bigger. Amina stood her ground, her hands shaking slightly but her gaze unwavering. She looked at the policemen, who seemed to revel in their supposed superiority. The eldest of them, a tall man with rough features, stepped forward, his gesture sharp and challenging. "So, student," he said with a grin, his voice low but with a hint of sarcasm, "you probably think you can just walk around at night. It's dangerous, don't you think?" Amina tried to remain calm, even though her insides were clenching. She took a deep breath and replied, "I'm just going home, officers. I didn't do anything wrong." The junior policeman standing behind him chuckled, exchanging glances with the senior one. His gaze expressed a strange curiosity mixed with disdain. "You didn't break anything, did you?" the elder one drawled, crossing his arms over his chest. "But you know, people in this city have to be more careful, especially people like you." These words made Amina flinch, but she kept herself in check. Her voice was even but tense. "I don't understand what you mean, officers. I just want to go home." The senior policeman leaned closer, his face only inches from hers. "And I think you're hiding something. Maybe you'd like to explain it to us. Or will I have to check your bag right here?" Amina felt her heart begin to beat faster. She knew she had to speak carefully to keep the situation from getting out of control. "You have no right to search my bag without reason," she said firmly, her voice trembling, but she did not back down. "Reason?" the elder chuckled, his eyes narrowing. "And you think that for people like you, I should look for a reason?" The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. The younger policeman coughed, trying to hide his awkwardness, but the older one continued, "Look, girl, I can make your life a lot easier if you just stop being smart and tell me what you've got there." Amina was silent, her gaze fixed on the policeman, but inside she was seething. She knew it would be dangerous to argue further, but she was not going to give in. She took a step back, keeping her distance. "I did nothing wrong," she repeated, her voice growing slightly louder. "If you continue, I'll be forced to file a complaint." The words made the senior policeman freeze for a moment, his face darkening. "A complaint," he said sarcastically. "You think anyone will listen to you? You're taking on too much." "My dear," Amina knew the situation was getting more and more tense. She looked around the street, but everything was empty. At that moment, she realized that the only thing she had was her own confidence in her voice. "I know my rights," she said, her voice firm despite her fear, "and I won't let you intimidate me." The younger policeman looked increasingly unsure. He looked at the older one, as if hoping he would stop, but the older one only grinned. "You know what?" the elder said, taking a step back. "We'll see each other again, and then we'll see how you talk." With that, he turned around and motioned for his partner to follow him. Amina remained standing, feeling her heart still beating like crazy. She knew that this meeting was just the beginning of something bigger. Amina walked quickly down the deserted street, trying not to look back. The cold night wind cut right to the bone, but her thoughts were not focused on that. Every word the policeman said echoed in her head, increasing her anxiety. She felt that her inner strength was at its limit, but she was not going to give up. In the distance, under the dim light of the street lamp, familiar figures appeared again. The policemen who had just let her go were standing by the car, talking. Amina felt her heart begin to pound again. She tried to swerve to avoid another collision, but she was spotted. "Hey, wait a minute." The senior police officer's loud voice rang out. Amina paused, taking a deep breath. She knew that if she tried to leave, the situation would only get worse. She turned around and met their gazes. The senior officer's eyes were challenging, while the junior one looked hesitant again, as if he wanted to say something but was afraid. "You still think you can just walk around here like nothing happened?" the senior policeman asked, coming closer. His voice was low and tense. "I'm going home, like I said before," Amina answered, trying to speak evenly despite the trembling in her voice. "Home, you say," he chuckled. "I wonder where people like you even get such confident words from." Amina felt anger begin to rise inside her, but she knew she couldn't let her emotions get the better of her. She straightened up and met his gaze. "I have the right to go home without threats or interference," she said firmly. The senior policeman took a step closer, his shadow blocking the dim light of the lantern. "You know that your stubbornness can get you into trouble," he said quietly, but there was a threat in his voice. "People who act like you rarely win in situations like this." The junior officers coughed again, trying to get the senior officer's attention. "Baby, that's enough," he muttered, barely audible. "She didn't do anything." The elder turned sharply to him. "Do you have something to say?" he snapped. "Or do you want to protect her?" The younger one fell silent, his shoulders slumped. Amina could see that he wasn't sure, but he couldn't resist his partner. She turned to the older one again. "If you have no reason to detain me, I'll go." The elder narrowed his eyes, his face becoming tense. "Go," he said finally, but his voice was laced with sarcasm. "But know that you can't escape the system. We see people like you every day." Amina, trying not to show her fear, took a step back, then turned and walked forward, but the words would stay with her for a long time. She knew she was facing more than just a personal threat. She was facing a system that seemed unfeeling and cold, but deep down, she knew she wouldn't let that break her. The footsteps faded, but her determination remained with her. She knew that she would fight for her truth, even if it took more strength than she currently had. Amina quickened her pace, her heart beating like crazy. The night air felt thick as syrup, and the street lights were too dim to dispel the fear that now filled her completely. She felt a shadow following her without even turning around. Every step, every sound seemed to echo her own terror. "Hey, stop!" A loud voice broke the silence, making her freeze. She turned around. The senior policeman was standing on the same street, his figure silhouetted against the headlights. He looked as if he was deliberately prolonging the moment, enjoying his supposed power. The junior officer stood behind him, his face still hesitant, but he made no move to intervene. "You think you can just leave, don't you?" The elder's voice was heavy and ominous. "You think we're done? You're wrong." Amina wanted to say something, but the words were stuck in her throat. She knew that any action or word she said could be misinterpreted. She took a deep breath, trying to find the strength, and quietly answered, "I didn't do anything. Please let me go home." The senior policeman chuckled, his face twisted in mockery. "Home," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You don't seem to understand how things work. You don't control when you leave, we decide." Amina felt her hands curl into fists. She knew she couldn't let fear get the better of her. She held her case, not letting him see how vulnerable she was. "I didn't break the law," she said firmly, her voice shaking slightly but determined. "You have no reason to detain me." The elder took a step forward, his eyes narrowed. "Reasons," he drawled with a cold smile. "Do you really think your words mean anything?" The junior officers intervened again, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. "Maybe we should let her go. She really didn't do anything." But the elder one cast a look at him full of contempt. "Have you forgotten who's in charge here?" he said sharply, then turned to Amina. "And have you forgotten that we're here for your safety? You could show a little respect." Amina knew that these words had nothing to do with safety. They were another attempt to suppress her, to make her feel insignificant. But she refused to give in. Respect must be earned, she said quietly but confidently. These words seemed to explode the atmosphere. The senior officer stepped closer, his face hardening. "You're taking on too much," he said. "You think you can talk like that to the guy in charge here?" But before he could say anything else, footsteps sounded behind them. The headlights illuminated the figure of a man who was quickly approaching. The moment was brief, but it changed everything. Amina felt her heart beat faster, a mixture of fear and hope. The man stopped and his voice sounded firm. "What's going on here?" The senior officer's turned, his expression changing, but only for a moment. Amina saw something like worry flicker in the policeman's eyes. But then he straightened up again, trying to maintain his superiority. "We're just doing our job," he said, his voice bordering on polite, but there was an edge of irritation in it. The man, whose figure was now clearly visible, took a step closer. He looked confident and collected. "It looks like something more than just a job," he said, looking the officer straight in the eye. "I can see that the girl is clearly frightened. Perhaps you could explain." This moment caught everyone off guard. The senior officer hesitated, his face tense. Amina felt the atmosphere around her change. This man clearly had no intention of leaving until the situation was cleared up. Her anxiety still hadn't gone away, but at that moment she realized she wasn't alone, and it was the beginning of change. Amina felt the tension in the air growing with each passing second. The senior police officer stood in front of her, his gaze hard. But there was something more to it than just irritation. There was a desire to prove his superiority. No matter what, her heart was pounding, but she tried to breathe evenly so as not to show her fear. "You think it's that simple?" His voice was sharp, breaking the silence. "You think you can leave without answering our questions?" Amina met his gaze, her voice even, although inside everything was trembling. "I already said that I did nothing. You have no reason to detain me." The policeman chuckled, his face hardening. "Reasons," he said, leaning slowly closer. "The reason is that I need to know you're not a threat." "Threats?" Amina asked, her voice quiet but challenging. "I'm just going home. Is that a threat?" The junior policeman standing behind took a step forward, but his voice was weak. "Maybe that's enough for us. She really didn't do anything." The elder gave him a sharp, irritated look. "You think I don't know what I'm doing?" he snapped. "If you have something to say, keep quiet." The younger one looked down, and Amina felt the loneliness wash over her again. She knew that none of them would stand up for her, but she also knew that she had to maintain her strength, even if it seemed impossible. "Listen, girl," that elder continued, his voice quieter, but still threatening. "You can say you did nothing, but we know it's not that simple. People like you always have something to hide." These words made Amina flinch, but she quickly pulled herself together. She understood that such words were aimed at breaking her. She took a step back, trying to keep her distance. "If you have reason to detain me, do so," she said firmly. "If not, I'm leaving." The senior policeman narrowed his eyes, his face becoming tense. It took a step closer, but before he could say anything else, footsteps were heard in the distance. The figure that had appeared in the bright circle of the street lamp was approaching quickly. "What's going on here?" asked a deep voice. Everyone turned around. It was the same man who had intervened earlier. His face was determined, and he immediately approached the police officers. "Are you detaining that girl again?" he asked, his tone stern. "I thought you already knew she hadn't done anything." The senior policeman raised his hands in protest, but his confidence was shaken. "We're just doing our job," he began, but his voice didn't sound very convincing. The man frowned, his gaze becoming cold. "You do. Your job is to protect, not to intimidate," he said, "and I will ensure that your actions are reviewed for compliance with that principle." The policeman fell silent, his face tense. Amina felt her breathing ease a little. She knew that this man had not come by chance, and his presence meant that she was not alone. "If you want to continue this conversation, do it in the station and according to the law," the man added. "But for now, you will leave this girl alone." The senior officers took a step back, his confidence completely shattered. He glanced at the junior, but the junior was no longer looking at him. Finally, the senior exhaled and turned. "We're not finished yet," he said, but his voice no longer sounded threatening. When the police left, the man turned to Amina. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice warm. Amina nodded, her eyes full of gratitude. This moment, despite all the tension, made her realize that there were people in the world willing to fight for justice. As the police officers disappeared around the corner, Amina felt the tension in her body slowly recede. But the calm was deceptive. The man who had intervened stood nearby, watching her carefully. His figure inspired confidence, but there was something strange in his gaze, something more than just sympathy. "Thank you for standing up for me," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "I don't know what I would have done without you." The man nodded, but his face remained serious. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "That's what anyone who sees injustice should do. But you have to understand that these people won't just leave it. They'll come back." Amina winced at the words, her mind refusing to accept that she could be the target of something more than just an incident on the street. "But why?" she asked, looking him in the eye. "I didn't do anything. Why are they targeting me like that?" The man looked at her carefully, as if considering whether to tell her everything. "It's not just you," he said finally. "It's a system. They operate this way to make people like you afraid. It's not an accident. It's part of how they maintain power." His words hit her like a bolt from the blue. She had never considered that a simple walk home could be part of something bigger, something sinister. She took a step back, her voice shaking. "So what now?" she asked. "I just want to go home. I don't want this to continue." The man sighed, his eyes darkening. "Sometimes we have no choice," he said, "but you have strength. I saw it when you didn't give in to them. And if you want to stop this, you have to be willing to fight." The words sounded like a challenge, but Amina wasn't sure if she was ready to accept it. She nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She didn't notice the man take a step back, his gaze lingering on the shadow around the corner. "You must be careful," he added, his voice lower. "They have ways of silencing you if you are not careful." Amina wanted to ask him what he meant, but the man suddenly turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the alley. Her head was spinning with thoughts. She looked around, suddenly realizing that the street had become too quiet. The silence seemed ominous to her. She moved slowly towards the house, her steps quick but careful. Her thoughts returned to the man's words. She felt that something had changed. Something had broken in the usual order of things. Her life was no longer as simple as it had been. At the next intersection, she heard a sound, soft but distinct. Footsteps. Someone was following her. Her heart pounded. She quickened her pace, but the sound did not disappear. She turned around, but saw no one. The dark silhouettes of the buildings looked menacing, and the streetlights did not seem bright enough to dispel the darkness. "Who's there?" she called out, trying to give her voice a confidence she didn't feel. There was no answer, but the sound of footsteps stopped, as if whoever was watching her had stopped to remain unnoticed. Amina took a deep breath and kept walking. She knew she couldn't stop. That fear must not take over. When she reached her street, the light in her window was on. This small island of light became a symbol of salvation for her. She ran inside, quickly closing the door behind her. Her breathing was heavy, but she felt relief at being safe. However, this feeling was short-lived. When she went to the window to pull down the curtains, she noticed a shadow. Someone was standing in front of her house, barely visible in the semi-darkness. Her heart started beating like crazy again. She closed the curtains and stepped back, her thoughts returning to the man's words. "They will be back." She realized that the warning had been real, and now she had to decide what to do next, when her life had become part of something much bigger. Amina couldn't sleep. The darkness of her room seemed thick, like fabric that couldn't be cut. Even the slightest noise outside the window made her shudder. The shadow standing in front of her house wouldn't leave her memory. She could no longer be sure that her house was a refuge. The clock on the wall showed 2 o'clock in the morning, when suddenly there was a knock on the window, not loud, but distinct. She rose abruptly from the bed, her heart pounding as if it was trying to escape from her chest. She walked slowly to the window, holding her breath, and carefully lifted the curtain. No one, just an empty street, dimly lit by streetlights. But this empty space did not calm her down. On the contrary, it was somehow threatening. She felt cold sweat running down her back. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice shaking but still trying to remain confident. There was no answer. Amina closed the curtain and stepped back, trying to convince herself that it was all just her imagination. But then there was a soft knock on the door. It was a barely audible sound, as if whoever was knocking didn't want to be heard. She frowned. Her feet rooted to the floor. Her gaze darted around the room, trying to find anything that could protect her. The knock came again, a little louder this time. Amina gathered all her courage to go to the door. She slowly leaned over to look through the peephole, but all she saw was an empty landing. No one, but the fear inside her grew like a fire fanned by the wind. She turned slowly, but before she could take a step back, her phone rang. The sound cut through the silence of the room like a knife. The screen glowed, revealing an unfamiliar number. Her hands shook as she picked up the phone. She pressed the answer button, but remained silent, not saying a word. "You think it's over?" A hoarse voice said. It was a whisper, barely audible, but there was a threat in it that made her blood run cold. "Who is it?" she breathed, her voice almost inaudible. "We know where you are. We see you." The voice continued. "You can hide behind closed doors, but that won't protect you." Amina felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She quickly hung up and threw the phone on the bed as if it might bite her. Her mind raced. Trying to figure out what to do, she grabbed her jacket and decided to leave the house, not knowing where to go, but knowing that staying here was dangerous. She opened the door and peered out into the hallway. Everything was quiet, but the silence was eerie. She took a step forward, then another. Her footsteps echoed down the empty hallway, increasing her anxiety. Stepping outside, she felt the cold air sting her skin. She looked around, but saw no one. Her feet carried her forward on their own, until she found herself on the familiar street where the man who had helped her earlier lived. She didn't know why she had decided to go there, but it seemed like the only right choice. His house stood at the end of the street, lit by a single street lamp. She walked up to the door and knocked, her breathing fast and uneven. The door opened almost immediately. A man stood on the threshold, his face serious but calm. "You came," he said, as if he had been waiting for her. "I knew they wouldn't stop." "Who were they?" Amina asked, her voice shaking but determined. "Why are they following me?" The man invited her inside and closed the door. He gestured for her to sit down in a chair and sat her down opposite her. There was a mixture of sadness and determination in his gaze. "Because you're not just a random victim," he said finally. "They see you as a threat. You're strong enough to speak out, and they're afraid of that." Amina looked at him, her thoughts racing. She didn't understand what exactly he meant, but she knew the man hadn't said everything yet. "What should I do?" she asked. "I don't know how to deal with this." "We will fight," he said, his voice firm, "but you need to be prepared for that. This isn't just a fight for your safety. This is a fight for the truth." Her heart sank. She knew there was more to come than she could have ever imagined, and now she was part of something that would change everything. Amina sat in the chair, feeling the anxiety growing inside her. The man who had helped her stood up and walked slowly around the room, as if considering where to begin. His house was simple but cozy, shelves of books, an old table, a stack of papers, but the atmosphere itself was tense, as if the walls knew more than they could tell. "You have to understand," he began, his voice calm but with a hidden strength. "This is no accident. You've encountered something that many people choose to ignore." Amina looked at him. Her voice trembled, but she decided to ask. "Why me? I just wanted to go home. I didn't do anything." The man stopped, his gaze becoming focused. "You did nothing wrong," he said, "but that's what scares them. The people behind these actions don't tolerate anyone refusing to obey. You've shown that you're not afraid to tell the truth. That's a threat to them." His words sounded like an explanation, but there was more to them. Amina felt like her story was part of something bigger that she didn't yet understand. She took a deep breath, trying to process what she had heard. "But what can I do?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "They're stronger. Their system is huge." The man sat down opposite her, his gaze firm. "Everyone who's ever fought for what's right has felt the same way," he said. "But if you back down, it lets them know they can keep going. You have to be strong, not just for yourself, but for anyone else who's faced the same thing." Her thoughts were chaotic. She remembered the moment when she stood in front of the police officers, feeling like the whole world had come crashing down on her. She remembered their cold looks, their words that cut like knives. She felt small, but at the same time, she knew that a spark of determination was igniting inside her. "But how?" she asked, her voice growing firmer. "How can I resist what seems insurmountable?" The man smiled, but there was no joy in his smile, only understanding. You are not alone, he said. People who want to see a fair world will always find each other. We will begin by telling your story. Light is the best way to drive away darkness. At that moment, the door of the house suddenly knocked. Amina shuddered. Her heart began to beat faster again. The man stood up calmly. His movements were confident. He gestured for her to stay where she was, then walked up to the door and opened it slightly. A man in uniform stood at the threshold. It was another policeman, not one she had seen before. His face was serious, but there was something strange in his eyes, a mixture of wariness and interest. Are you Mr. Hudson? He asked, his voice even but with an underlying tension. The man nodded. Yes, how can I help you? He answered calmly, but Amina noticed how his hands tensed slightly. We have information that you interfered with the investigation. The policeman said, we would like to ask you a few questions. Mr. Hudson paused, then opened the door wider. Of course, he said, but I think it would be useful for you to hear the other side of the story. Perhaps you would like to talk to this young girl. The policeman glanced inside, his gaze landing on Amina. She felt her breathing quicken, but she didn't look away. She knew this was the moment of truth, the moment that would determine her next steps. You have the right to remain silent, the policeman said, but there was no threat in his voice. But if you have something to say, it could change everything. Amina took a deep breath. She realized that fear was her greatest enemy, and that if she didn't speak up now, she might lose her chance at justice. I will tell you, she said, her voice shaking but determined. I will tell you everything that happened. The uniformed policeman stepped inside, his gaze heavy and intent. Amina clenched her fists, feeling the tension fill the room. The man who had just stood up for her remained standing at the door, a shield between her and the new face of the system. Tell me what happened, the officer said, his voice even but stern. Amina took a deep breath, trying to gather her thoughts. She felt trapped, but she knew this was her chance to speak, to talk about what she had been through, and finally find the truth. These police officers, they stopped me on the street, she began, her voice quiet but growing stronger with each passing second. They were threatening me, asking questions I couldn't answer. I was just walking home. The policeman wrote down her words, his face impassive, but when she mentioned how the senior officers had started threatening her, his gaze flickered ever so slightly. Threats? He asked, looking up. Are you sure about that? I'm sure, Amina answered firmly. I didn't even understand what caused their aggression. I didn't do anything. The man standing next to him nodded. She speaks the truth, he added. I saw them trying to intimidate her. This is not an accident, but an abuse of power. The policeman nodded slowly, as if considering what he had heard. Then he looked at Amina, his voice softening. Do you know who your father is? He suddenly asked, his question sounding unexpected, like a bolt from the blue. Amina frowned. Her heart sank. She hadn't expected anyone to ask her at a time like this. Her voice trembled as she answered. Yes, my father is a police captain, Captain Johnson. The policeman frowned, his face momentarily expressionless. He clearly hadn't expected that answer. He quickly composed himself, but a shadow of worry appeared in his eyes. Captain Johnson, he repeated, as if to clarify. Are you sure? Absolutely, Amina said firmly, and he will know everything that happened. The man standing at the door chuckled, but there was no malice in his smile. It was the smile of a man who had seen the truth begin to win. The policeman stepped back, his face pale. He clearly knew this was no accident. Captain Johnson was a well-known name in their ranks. He was a man who would not tolerate injustice, a man who would protect his people, and now he would learn that his own daughter had been a victim of abuse. We have to investigate, the officers said quickly, trying to remain calm. We'll get to the bottom of this, I promise. It's too late for you to promise, the man at the door said quietly, his voice calm but threatening. This is a personal matter now. You've not only broken the law, you violated the honor of Captain Johnson's family. The policeman nodded, his hands shaking as he put his notebook away. He took a few steps toward the door, taking one last look at Amina. We'll be in touch with you soon to clarify the details, he said, trying to sound firm, but his voice betrayed his fear. When the door closed, silence filled the room. Amina felt her legs go weak. She sat her down on the chair, her breathing fast and heavy. It'll be okay, the man said, his voice warm. Now they know who they're dealing with. That'll change everything. But Amina knew that this battle was not over. Her father would find out what had happened, and she believed that he would come to her defense. But she also knew that the truth she had only just begun to uncover was much deeper than she could have imagined. The dim light from the hallway lamp cast strange shadows on the walls, moving with every step the policeman took. He left Hudson's house, where Amina remained, but the feeling of heaviness did not leave him, as if the whole world was shrinking, leaving him alone in the middle of an invisible circle. Just recently he had felt confident. His badge and uniform seemed like an impenetrable shield, but now it was far from the truth. The names that echoed inside him hit him like hammer blows. Captain Johnson, the man was a legend in their department. Known for his strictness and unwavering sense of justice, there was no compromise for him, especially when it came to injustice. And now this man's daughter was the victim of his colleagues' actions. The thoughts swirled in the cop's head like a dance of ghosts, each whispering that everything would collapse. He took a few steps forward, but his legs felt like cotton wool. His breathing became shallow, as if the air around him had suddenly thinned. He felt as if someone was watching him from the shadows. Even when the street was empty, every shadow, every rustle now seemed like a threat. He stopped, wiping the sweat from his forehead, and looked at his shaking hands. It wasn't the fear he felt when he looked at danger. It was a feeling of vulnerability that was unfamiliar to him. The phone in his pocket vibrated, startling him. He quickly pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and saw that one of his partners was calling. He felt a moment of relief, but when he answered, he heard the voice on the other end of the line, shaking just like his own. "Are you okay?" the partner asked. "I heard what happened. Do they know?" "They know," the policeman answered quietly, his voice hoarse. "They know everything. Do you understand what that means?" There was silence on the other end of the line, and he heard his partner sigh heavily. "This is the end," he said finally. "Johnson won't let this go. We both know he'll see it through." The cop ran a hand over his face, trying to compose himself, but inside, everything screamed that his partner was right. Captain Johnson was not one to turn a blind eye to injustice, especially when it came to his family. "Is there anything we can do?" he asked, trying to find some glimmer of hope. "Nothing," the partner answered briefly. "The only thing you can do is confess everything and hope for mercy, but you know there won't be any." The policeman hung up, not wanting to hear those words anymore, but they were already filling his mind. Ringing like a bell, he leaned against the wall and took a deep breath. He tried to remember how he had gotten to this point, how the confidence he thought he had was shattered. He had always thought he was on the side of power. Now that power was turning against him. The darkness of the street seemed thicker than usual. He looked at the shadows, as if expecting someone to emerge from them to take him. Every sound around him was louder than it should have been, and he felt his heart begin to beat faster. Footsteps behind him made him turn around, but there was no one there. Images swirled in his head. Amina's gaze, her firm voice, her words about Captain Johnson. He knew his position wasn't just precarious, it was doomed. His past, the times he had abused his power, bullied others, now loomed before him like a huge wall he could no longer get around. He had always thought that his uniform made him invulnerable, that he was above the law, but now he realized that was an illusion. He took out his phone again, his hands shaking. He knew he should call, but he couldn't bring himself to do so. Finally, he dialed his boss's number. The voice on the other end of the line answered quickly but coldly. "What happened?" the boss asked, his tone stern. "We have a problem," the policeman began, trying to keep his voice down. I don't know how to say this, but it concerns Captain Johnson, his daughter." There was silence on the other end, but that silence was louder than any words. "Do you understand what you've done?" a voice full of hidden rage finally said. "Do you understand what will follow?" The policeman closed his eyes, his body shaking. He knew he understood, but it was too late. The chief's dark office was lit only by a dim lamp, which cast a feeble glow on the desk covered with papers. The policeman sat opposite him, his hands in his lap, but his fingers trembled nervously. He could feel beads of sweat trickling down his temples, and he could hear his every breath echoing in his head. Across from him sat the chief, motionless as a statue, with an expression on his face that was unreadable. "Do you realize what you've done?" the chief asked, his voice low and sharp, like the crack of a whip. The policeman nodded, but the movement was barely noticeable. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead of answering, he stared at his shoes, as if they could tell him how to fix everything that had happened. Speak, the chief continued, his tone growing colder. You dragged us all into this mud, and now you will answer? The policeman began, his voice shaking. I didn't think it would go this far. It's just, she didn't comply. All we wanted was make her afraid. That chief interrupted, his eyes narrowing. Did you think that your humiliation would leave no consequences? You played with fire, and now this fire will burn everything around you. The policeman fell silent again. It felt like the room was closing in, like the walls were closing in on him. He remembered Amina's face, her steadfastness, her determination not to give in to his threats. She hadn't broken, and now her father, Captain Johnson, stood up for her. The man was known for pursuing justice at any cost. Even the chief seemed afraid of what would happen next. Does Johnson know yet? The policeman asked quietly, his voice barely audible. The boss frowned, his jaw clenching. Of course he does, he snapped. And you know what? You only have yourself to blame. He's personally demanding an investigation. And not just any investigation. He wants you and your partner prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The words struck the policeman like lightning. He grabbed the edge of the table, trying to keep his balance. His eyes darted around as if he was looking for a way out of the room, but the only way out was blocked by fear. But it was a mistake, he muttered. We didn't know who she was. Mistake. The boss raised his eyebrows. His voice grew louder. A mistake is when you accidentally stumble, and what you did was a conscious choice. You thought that she would simply get scared and leave, but you chose the wrong victim. The policeman felt the lump in his throat growing bigger. He wanted to justify himself, to find words that could soften the situation, but every word he said only made things worse. I can't apologize. He tried. Maybe if I talked to her. The chief laughed, but there was no humor in his laughter. It was a short, harsh sound, full of contempt. An apology? Do you think an apology will fix what you've done? He asked. This isn't just a personal affront. It's a systemic problem. And now Johnson is going to expose us all. Those words were the final blow. The policeman felt his knees buckle. He realized that his situation was much worse than he could have imagined. He had thought that this was just a routine incident, another incident that no one would notice. But now he was in the spotlight, and his name was linked to something that could destroy his career. What should I do? He asked, his voice full of despair. The boss leaned back in his chair, his gaze icy. Nothing, he said. You've done everything. Now you wait to be called in for questioning, and if you think you can somehow get out of this, remember who's up against you. Johnson won't stop until he gets the truth, and I'm not even going to defend you. The policeman stood up, his legs shaking. He walked slowly out of the office, feeling the cold sweat trickle down his back. His world was crumbling around him, and he couldn't do anything about it. The hallway seemed endless, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He knew this was just the beginning, and the fear he felt now was just the first wave of the horror that was to come. The massive door slammed shut, the dull sound echoing down the hallway. The policeman Saturday in a holding cell, surrounded by gray concrete walls. The dim light from the overhead lamp illuminated his face, which was frowning in a mixture of fear and despair. There was no uniform, no badge, no voice. All he had left was the knowledge of his vulnerability. He had nowhere to run. Every minute dragged on like an hour. He heard footsteps and voices outside the cell, growing louder and quieter. He didn't know who it was, and that made him even more afraid. His own breathing seemed too loud in this deathly silence. He looked at his hands, which had once been a symbol of power, but now trembled like a frightened child. Johnson won't stop, flashed through his mind. The words of his superior rang in his ears like thunder. He tried to concentrate, to think of a way out of this situation, but every thought returned to the same thing. He was completely exposed. There was a sound of footsteps outside the door, stopping right outside his cell. The lock clicked, the door opened slightly, and a man in a formal suit walked in. He was Captain Johnson. His face was cold, as if carved from stone. There was no anger in his eyes, only determination. Do you know why I'm here? He asked, his voice low but calm. That calm was more frightening than his scream. The policeman looked up, but couldn't meet his gaze. He swallowed, his hands clenching into fists. I didn't mean to do anything, he managed, his voice shaking. It was a mistake. We didn't know. Mistake, Johnson interrupted, his voice hardening. You call humiliating my daughter a mistake. You used your power to bully an innocent man. You turned your badge into a weapon, and now you want to justify yourself. The policeman lowered his head. The words caught in his throat. Johnson took a step closer, his figure looming over the seated man. You thought the uniform would protect you? The captain continued. You thought it would give you the right to do whatever you wanted, but now you're going to learn what it means to be responsible for your actions. He straightened up, looking down at the policeman from his height. The law will protect my daughter, as you should have, but now the law will turn against you, and it will be fair. The policeman looked at him, his eyes full of fear. He tried to say something, but Johnson raised his hand, stopping him. Your words mean nothing anymore, he said. Your future now depends on the court. Johnson turned and walked out, leaving the cop alone in silence. The sound of his footsteps echoed down the hallway and then disappeared. The cop felt a cold sweat run down his back. He knew it was the end. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, the trial began. Amina sat next to her father, her hands clasped tightly, but her eyes lit up with determination. She knew that justice would finally be served. The prosecutor presented evidence, security footage, witness statements, reports of past incidents. It all added up to a picture of a man who had abused his power for far too long. When the judge announced the verdict, the room was silent. The policeman had been found guilty and sentenced to imprisonment, as well as a lifetime ban from any service connected with the government. The words echoed around the room, and a small smile appeared on Amina's face. It was not a malicious smile, but an expression of relief and faith in justice. Later, as Amina left the court, she felt the fresh air touch her face. Her father stood next to her, his face serious but his eyes filled with pride. You did it, he said, putting his hand on her shoulder. You showed them you don't give up. Amina nodded, her eyes full of determination. She knew there was still a lot of fighting to do, but now she was ready. She felt like she had taken the first step toward changing the world. And in that moment, she realized that good always finds a way to win, even in the darkest corners. Friends, what do you think about this story? Have you ever experienced injustice or discrimination in your life? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments. Your voice is very important to us, and each of you is incredibly valuable. We are grateful to you for your support and for helping us raise such important topics. If the story touched you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like it. It helps us tell more such meaningful stories. We wish you a wonderful day, kindness and justice in your life.